Thank you. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge the traditional ancestral territory we're having this lecture on, of the Mississauga First Nation. So I thank them for allowing us to speak here. Regarding violence, as it was mentioned, it was not in my lecture, but I had a fitting quote from the Brazilian educator Paulo Freire that I thought would help understand this issue of violence, at least the way I use it throughout my lecture. Paulo Freire says in his Pedagogy of the Oppressed, any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his and her pursuit of self-determination as a responsible person is one of oppression. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called forth their existence as oppressed? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. With that, I would like to start with a subject not often talked about, colonizing the minds. Not just in Toronto, I know you think that's a monopoly for Canada. No, it's everywhere. Colonizing the mind is something that has affected the struggle as much as colonizing the land, if not more. I want to quote Ngugi wa Thiong'o, one of Africa's most important contemporary writers from Kenya. He says, Ngugi says, the oppressed and the exploited of the earth maintain their defiance against imperialism, liberty from theft. But the biggest weapon wielded and actually daily unleashed by imperialism against that collective defiance is the cultural bomb. The effect of a cultural bomb is to annihilate a people's belief in their names, in their languages, in their environment, in their heritage of struggle, in their unity. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement, and it makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. It even plants serious doubts about themselves and about their struggle. Possibilities of victory are seen as remote, ridiculous dreams. The intended results are despair, despondency, and the collective death wish. The BDS campaign is exactly in response to this attempt to make us despair. This colonizing of the mind was pursued by Israel from very early on. But I'll just give one glaring example from the first Intifada that started in 1987. In December 1987, just a few days after the first Palestinian Intifada, or civil resistance, broke out, Israel Radio announced that the Israeli army had ordered all 1,194 schools in the West Bank closed until further notice. All the universities were shut, and a few months later, all the kindergartens were closed too. Palestinian education was forced to go underground, so clandestine classes were held. Education was effectively criminalized. It was held in homes, offices, community centers, mosques, and so on. On 19 April 1989, a Jerusalem Post report said that the Israeli police had, quote, uncovered a network of illegal classes held by West Bank universities in private high schools in East Jerusalem. A few days later, 24 April 1989, the Israeli army raided the YMCA building in Ramallah, which housed the departmental offices of Bir Zayt University, throughout the closure of the campus. A warning was delivered to the university administration, quote, under no circumstances can you teach in houses or anywhere else. If we find anyone teaching or any students carrying books, we will take appropriate measures against them. And certainly appropriate measures were taken. But even as far back as 1948, with the establishment of the State of Israel on the ruins of Palestinian society, as part of what Palestinians call the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing of 1948, when the great majority of Palestinians were dispossessed and uprooted. Tens of thousands of Palestinian books were destroyed by Israel after the establishment of the state, according to research by an Israeli Jewish academic at Ben Gurion University. He says, Israel plundered and destroyed tens of thousands of Palestinian books in the years after the state's establishment, because these were deemed security threats. The exact number, I think, is 27,000 books were destroyed. And he says that Israel destroyed those books in the framework of its plan to, quote, Judaize the country and cut off its Arab residents from their nation and culture. Fast forward to the present, we see that the BDS campaign is expanding across the globe. And some of us wonder, even some of us who founded this movement wonder, how did we get here so quickly? I'm one of the most optimistic in the movement, actually, and I never imagined back in 2005, when we started this movement, that we would be here in 2010 to see major trade unions across the globe, major artists, the Pixies, Costello, Santana, Gil Scott-Heron, and so on, joining the boycott, major academics and cultural figures everywhere. We never thought we would get here so fast. Because in the South African experience of the anti-apartheid movement, it took about 25 years on average to see anything happen in the mainstream Western society. People forget that. People say, oh, but the South African boycott was tremendous. Everyone supported the boycott. There was no resistance. People have a short memory. They're talking about the 80s. People forgot the 50s and 60s and 70s where nothing was happening. It took a very long time. I remember I was in the anti-apartheid movement at my university, Columbia University in New York, where I used to participate in demonstrations holding up a sign, abolish apartheid. And once a colleague who was not active was asking me, do you really think that this will happen in your lifetime? I said, no, probably not. But I do it as a moral obligation, regardless whether it will happen in my lifetime. But it did happen in my lifetime, and no one can take that experience from me. Now, the reality in Israel is calling for BDS even more. The situation on the ground, the siege of Gaza, the rising fanatic right inside Israel have all made BDS even more critical, more urgent. Some prominent Israeli academics and intellectuals have recently protested what they call the rise of fascism in the state. Of course, it's fascism now because it's affecting the Jewish Israelis. But regardless. In fact, some of them have drafted a declaration for the independence from fascism, signed by hundreds of academics and intellectuals, Jewish Israelis. Some of the most famous playwrights, actors, academics, and poets have signed that statement. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency talks about the image of Israel given this rise of the right, and it explains Israel's image problem as having somebody like Netanyahu, who very clearly against peace, as they put it, to put it very mildly, and somebody like Lieberman, whom they call is perceived as a racist bully. Again, putting it very mildly. So given this, the Brand Israel campaign, the campaign sponsored by the Israeli Foreign Ministry in 2005 and tested in Toronto, that was the first testing field for them, has come very close to an end. The Jewish Telegraphic Agency admits that rebranding has failed. Given the reality on the ground, we've got to do much more than polish the image of Israel with artists and poets and dancers going around the world and saying Israel is wonderful, white, enlightened, and democratic. It will take a real change of policy inside Israel. Even the Jewish Telegraphic Agency is now acknowledging that. But coming on the heels of Israel's markedly devastating war of aggression on Lebanon, Israel's bloodbath in Gaza did not help it either. Images of white phosphorus being thrown on schools, UN shelters, burning people alive, devastated Israel's rebrand campaign.